Our next panel is proof that the Heartland is not just the place for geospatial leadership, it's also the home to some of the most creative geospatial innovators in the country. To lead off this panel, we are grateful to Mr. Frank Hopper, who is the Managing Director of Capital Innovators. Frank?
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming back after the break. I hope that you all got to refill your coffee cups and some water. I think this panel is going to be really exciting. We're going to start by having each of them talk a little bit about their companies. They have some slides prepared for everybody, and then we'll move into some Q&A, and we might have time for Q&A from the audience, so be thinking about your questions, and we'll tackle those as they come. So we're going to go ahead and kick things off. First up, we have the Chief Revenue Officer of Eiwa, my bad, Carlos Hirsch.
Thanks so much. Should I go to podium? Yep. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Carlos Hirsch, Chief Revenue Officer for Eiwa. And a lot of people have issues pronouncing that name. And I want to give you a little background before I get to all the slides. But we, as a mission, as a company, we want to mobilize the world's economic knowledge. And the way we're doing that is by building the best farming ecosystem data cloud. And back to the name real quick about the company. There are two sources of the name. One is the tree on the Habitare movie. So that tells you we're a startup company that started a few years ago. And the other version of the name is a Japanese word that means harmony, and that's part of what we do as this mission, which is mostly, and looks like, it's a mission of organizing and structuring data that today, as we saw in the morning, and I appreciate the panelists earlier today that explained a little bit more about the use of sensors in agriculture and how agriculture is actually changing around the world. There is a lot of data out there, not just sensor data, but also field data, machinery data, and all other sources of data you can imagine. And there was a term that was used a lot around in the industry about siloed data. And the siloed data gives you an impression that this data is all nicely organized and taken care of. And we kind of changed that term a little bit, and we talk about orphan data. And the reason for that is there is a lot of data out there, but a lot of people don't even know who owns it or who it belongs to, and how do we keep all that data talking to each other. And the real value of doing analytics with data is having it structured and organized. So that's our mission at Eiwa. Quickly about the company and where we are. So the company started about 9 years ago in Argentina. Today we are a US corporation based here in St. Louis. Despite most of our team still in Argentina, our developers, but we do have a growing team in Brazil, and here in the US we're growing our team as well. 50% of our market is here in the US, 50% of our revenue, about 30% of the revenue in Brazil, 20% in Argentina. And if you look at the map and some of the comments that were made in the morning about crops, if you put together US, Brazil, and Argentina, you have 90% of all the soybean acres in the world. Just 3 countries. And 50% of all the corn acres in the world. So that gives you an idea of the distribution and the importance of those acres around the world and how the impact of that around the world is. So obviously a lot of the companies focus on row crops and in general in agriculture have a very big interest in these markets, and they are usually their largest markets as well. Moving on a little bit about what we do and what we built. We built this product called Eiwa Vault. It's our platform. And the way that it came about, a little bit like John mentioned earlier, that sometimes innovation comes, you try and solve problem A, and you come up and solve a whole different problem. We developed this platform for ourselves because at the beginning, the company started doing what's called microplots of soybean breeding. So these are seed companies that are developing new varieties of soybeans around the world, and they have to test them out, right, to make sure that they're selecting the right varieties. Obviously, that takes time. Usually takes 6 to 7 years to develop a new variety of soybeans or corn. And by applying remote sensing, which is what the company was doing at the time, we were able to accelerate their data collection and increase by a lot the accuracy of that data. How was that done previously to that? You have breeders that are the ones running those trials, go into the field, taking notes, gathering them back into their spreadsheets, applying statistics and trying to determine what is the best variety. Using remote sensors, mostly in this case were UAVs, we were able to keep that consistency across millions of these plots. Just to give you an idea, just last season we closed very close to almost 4 million plots of soybean breeding alone of data processing ourselves. That is, to give you an idea, quick math, we have to be processing 20,000 plots a day to match that in a year, and that does not happen in a full year. It's a lot shorter than that. So as a company processing all this data for this very multi-million companies, we needed to make sure that that data was organized and structured, so we built our tool for ourselves. And turns out, talking to these breeders and other crop scientists, they also had a problem putting these big puzzle together with all these separate puzzle pieces from remote sensing, machinery data, soil data, weather data, and we said, well, you know what? What if we turn the product that we built for ourselves into a commercial product and solve this problem for the industry? So that's how Eiwa Vault came together. So Eiwa Vault is this core platform that is now crop agnostic. So we launched this about 1.5 years ago. Now we're doing helping companies with crop protection trials, which is fungicides, herbicides, fertilizer companies, and even the crop companies. We're doing trials and helping farmers as well with sunflower, watermelon, tomatoes, wheat, barley, you name it. We can handle that data. And the part of the solution is, and why other systems maybe that were in the market before weren't so successful as we are so far being, is they used to look at data first and then try to correlate those tabular format data into geospatial, or trying to relate that to a location in a field or a country. We took the other approach. We went back and said, let's do geospatial first and be that my unique building block to then start bringing tabular data to it. So we can name, it could be a small microplot, a big plot, an entire field, or a management area, which is very common in precision agriculture in a field. So we can ingest massive different kinds of layers. They can come from machinery or from precision ag tools. We can overlay that over trials to have a better understanding of what those results are. And not only the visual, but also the tabular data associated with those images. And then we can apply data analytics. Yesterday there was a comment about, and I think it was John too, that said, asked ChatGPT about a source of the data that he was getting as an answer. You can only do that if your data is organized. So that's what we're trying to solve for these companies, where they now can apply analytics from our own library, and we're expanding that library in the next couple months with partnerships of other companies that develop specifically analytics for GIS layers, for tabular data, apply that into our platform. So in there, you'll be able to see all in one place. You'll be able to see your drone imagery, your satellite data, your soil data, your field notes, everything in one place. It also has a mobile app that comes with it, because field notes are still very, very important for phenotypic notes, disease notes, and others that synchronizes back with the platform. And it all comes down to an area in the system that's called the data management system. That pretty much is a spreadsheet in the cloud, kind of a pivot table in the cloud, where the very first column there on the left is every one of those building blocks I mentioned earlier. That it could be a plot within a grid, it could be an entire grid, or it could be a management zone within an area. It's a geospatial entity that starts gathering data. So throughout the season, from pre-planting all the way to harvest and even post-harvest, you can collect data from multiple sources, and each one of these columns could be weather data, soil data, and all the other kinds of data that I just mentioned to you, machinery, and we can integrate with a lot of those common existing data layers. And in addition to that, by requests of some large farmers that we're working with, we're also integrating financial data from their ERP. So that will try to close the gap between agronomic practices and ROI. So this is basically the model. We look at data acquisition, data management, applying analytics, and then being able to share that in a common format across, if you're looking at a company like Syngenta, which is one of our customers, you have an R&D team, and they might have their own R&D database, and then you have the product placement team, which have their own database, and then you have the marketing team that has their own database. And sometimes those don't talk to each other, just because they have different formats sometimes and different information. Here you'll be able to common paste all that and share that information across. And obviously at the very end, once you have the data organized, then it's easy to build dashboards. So because it's all geospatial, you can click on the map, select the data, very interactive information gathering, also some statistical data can be shared and observed. And then you can go back and understand, okay, why is this outlier coming out like this? Why is this data looking like that? You can go back and look at the drone imagery, special image from maybe your planter or your harvester, any of those correlations that today it's really hard to look. So that's a quick intro about what we're doing. Again, welcome questions later, and thank you for inviting us to participate on this event.
Thanks, Carlos. Up next, we have the CEO of ZeoAir, Bronwyn Morgan.
Good morning. Well, I am the other part of this puzzle in the drone space. I'm an FAA certified drone pilot, FAA safety rep, and FAA drone pro. And I want to talk to you about how we're solving this whole issue of data and drones, but also with a twist. So at ZeoAir, our whole focus is really providing the tools for data analytics, data collection, for monitoring, inspection, and security, both with humans and also with autonomy. And so right now we have huge problems. I think we've heard that all morning. And so we're looking at $2 trillion in broken infrastructure. Weather disaster damage exceeding $100 billion. Critical infrastructure is challenged with these particular threats and risks, and also climate and environment. And there's also a lack of American-made equipment and software, and I'm going to get to that in a second. So what I'm finding that the industry needs is simple online mission management for companies that are outsourcing their missions for drone services, single source data collection, also deep learning and data analytics, and we're building that out right now so that we have a model that provides not only the data capture, but also deep learning so that we could be better prepared to share with our customers what we're noticing and what we're gathering, and providing them much more pinpointed, detailed, and accurate information as quickly as possible. And also touchless operations for remote locations in very dangerous terrain. Also American-made or St. Louis-made. The sectors that we focus on at ZeoAir are critical infrastructure, civil infrastructure, climate, environment, and then also disaster response. We've flown some of those missions already for companies like Airbus Aerial around disaster, where we had to go in at the last minute and collect data with a very changing environment based on weather, based on other aircraft in the environment, military installations nearby, to capture data both for government response immediately for evacuation, as well as things like erosion, so that they can determine over time, is this going to be a viable area both for private sector and for community-based planning? And imagine a world where all this kind of data is needed and drones are deployed, the data is processed on the drone, and no human pilot is required on site. Well, that's where we're going here at ZeoAir. So we are an outsourced AI-based drone services data analytics, as well as mission management portal for enterprise inspection and mapping. And what we're delivering right now, of course, are human pilots, because we've not yet cleared, as an industry, all of the FAA requirements for beyond visual line of sight using tools like detect and avoid. Long story, I'll tell you that during Q&A if you have those questions. But also an automated network so that you don't have to have people right on site to do this work when data is needed very frequently. 5G enabled, we will be BVLOS compliant, and with the right drones and sensors to meet the needs of the customer. And then also, we are working on building our own drone, so that I can actually do what I need to do during critical moments across these sectors. Because if it's infrastructure inspection, if it is during a disaster, I need a weather-resilient drone that operates at the edge of what physics will allow. And that's what we're working on. There'll be one for us, a Lexus version, and then there'll be a Toyota version for the market. We've talked to some customers who are very interested both on the government side and then also on the commercial side to have equipment that is American-made, American-based software systems as well. And I know as a drone pilot, there are a lot of things that I need that I can't find on the market, and we want to be able to provide that. And then also our freestanding remote drone towers, so that we can actually place our towers in remote locations, hard to reach locations, with nested drones, 5G enabled, climate secure, as well as able to perform in an environment with energy, both from a natural perspective, and we'll have to have backup resources as well. So this data can be captured, processed, sent back to our servers, and then also analyzed for customer delivery. And there will be also a mobile app too. But we are working on these things right now because we recognize that from an agricultural perspective, but for us that kind of falls under climate and environment, we've got some pretty big challenges in front of us with food supply, food security. I think you've heard that today. The nice thing for me is that we're all on the same page, but with heavy precipitation, agricultural runoff, and I attended the University of Illinois with a minor in agriculture, so this is very close to my heart, and warming temperatures, we've got a lot that we need to fix. And in the drone business, because I am low altitude with very high resolution and able to utilize hyperspectral, multispectral, thermal, infrared, and LiDAR, I'm able to get data in some of the most challenging locations, but at a resolution that's so incredibly specific. And that's what we're excited about, being able to do that very quickly, above canopy, below canopy, depending on the environment of vegetation that we're in, around glacial areas. We're able to provide that in addition to what we're doing with critical infrastructure. And the reason why we chose these adjacent categories of climate, environment, and disaster and infrastructure is because we believe this data, especially around climate, will have a huge impact on infrastructure, as I think we well know. And we want to be able to analyze that data and help the customer better understand why some of these things are happening, whether it's telecom towers, wind turbines, solar parks. We'll be able to provide that data as well. We're also partnering with a company where we're going to be able to provide micro-based AI weather so that we can tell weather at a pin drop, not general weather, but very specific weather right here over this building if we need it, so that if we're flying a mission, we can know if we go or no go, but also that data will help inform us on some of the changes in weather patterns and climate that are impacting that specific location. And then also, the other big focus for us is disaster, and being able to have pre-positioned teams, both human and then autonomous, to be able to go out and actually assess what's happening in the world of, wildfires, drought. I know we're about to face one here in Missouri, drought. And this is very serious stuff that's all happening right now. And so we're working on providing those solutions as we speak, because we know that over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see dramatic changes. And so we want to get after it right now. And that's what we're here to do, is to provide that support both to the commercial and private sector, as well as to government entities. Whether it's NOAA or whether it is Ameren, we would be able to provide those services, leveraging location-based data to pinpoint the problems, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and then also the equipment that is needed back at our command and control center that will help us analyze and then also perform remotely and safely. That's it. I'm Bronwyn. This is ZeoAir, and I look forward to any of your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Up next, we have Nick Reinke, CEO of Habitare.
All right, thank you all. I get excited hearing these other folks talk because I see the dots connecting immediately with what we do, and that's one of the cool things, I think, here in St. Louis. I'm Nick Reinke, CEO of Habitare. And at Habitare, we are an advanced science and technology company dedicated to building the infrastructure to support sustainable agricultural production in the context of a changing climate. So like the introduction of Eiwa, Habitare for us, it's creating a sustainable habitat and on the land, terra. So before I get into what we do as a company, I'll tell you a little bit about who I am and where I come from and why I care about this topic. So this is the family farm back in Lisbon, North Dakota, that we affectionately refer to as Poverty Flats. And those guys in the top right corner, that's dad, grandpa, and uncle. And I gotta tell you, those guys weren't thinking about climate change. They weren't worried about that. They were paying attention to changing weather patterns. They were adapting their farm and their practices and maximizing their productivity. But a lot of the things that we're looking at today with environmental markets and all these different impacts of ag that we're getting wiser on, at the end of the day, they're still worried about how they steward that farm for the next generation, even in the context of all these big global movements around climate and marketplace development. And that's where I think a lot about that fourth generation. That's me and my brother down in the bottom right corner. He's taking over the farm for the first time this year. Really, really wet spring. He got a planting season that got condensed down to about 2 weeks for him as a solo farmer to get 1,500 acres of crop in 2 weeks of planting, and really crossing his fingers that it didn't keep raining. And that's just what he's facing. We keep talking up there about abnormal seasons. And the reality is abnormal is the new normal, not to use that cliche, but that's where these things are headed. So that's why I get excited about the work that we do. So I'll take a second and create a little bit of context around this. So I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with climate markets, climate targets, but there's a lot of press on it. I think the key components of that can sometimes get lost in the ways that companies talk about their targets. So at the end of the day, that chart on the left that you're seeing here, see the screen left? Yep. Chart on the left that you're seeing here, that one's from McKinsey, but that's generally reflective of the latest in climate science, saying what we need to do as a planet to stave off the worst effects of climate change. So when you hear a company make a climate commitment, generally speaking, any corporation that's making that climate commitment is going to be roughly aligned around these targets for their own corporate emissions footprint. So about a 50% reduction by 2030, aggressive target, of course, given that we're already halfway through 2023, and net zero emissions by 2050. So on the right there is a breakdown of scopes of emissions for companies that they're looking at. And those scopes are scope 1, which is going to be within a company's operations, so like owned facilities and emissions associated there. Scope 2 is going to be energy sourcing. How is their energy produced? What are the emissions with the energy that they used? Scope 3 is going to be everything upstream and downstream. So from our perspective, scope 3 is where agriculture lives. And agriculture is a huge share of most companies' emissions if they're doing anything with agricultural commodities. So won't spend too much time here, but a quick touch on, there's a lot of terms that get thrown around: offsets, insets, value chain interventions, things like that. Just a couple quick examples of companies that are directly working with agriculture in two very different ways. So Microsoft is one where, there's not a lot of corn going into their computers, right? But they have purchased offsets from agriculture, so focused on soil carbon removal and storage specifically. Actually, in my role prior to joining Habitare, I was working at Tritera, and that was kind of a mind-blowing experience for me coming from the farm, that we negotiated a deal for Microsoft to basically pay farmers to store carbon in their soil on behalf of Microsoft. So it's a cool mechanism, but the thing that I'm most interested in and that we're most interested in at Habitare is looking at the actual value chain. Like, let's tie these real world outcomes and impacts to climate to the real world commodity as it moves through the value chain. So you see companies like PepsiCo making really aggressive commitments in this space, and with good reason. The single largest share of emissions across all scopes of emissions for PepsiCo is agriculture. They don't have great ways to directly influence that. They're experimenting with how to inform farmers as to improve practices, but they also need to be able to gather the data that substantiates their claims and creates confidence in how they talk about what they do. So as I mentioned, some of these drivers are really focused around soil carbon. And it's interesting, there are really incredible things that we can do with the soil, so that's really exciting. But that's just one tiny slice of the overall picture. We need to look at more than just soil carbon impacts. We need to look at the holistic picture of what does this do for farmland productivity? What does it do for sources of emissions like nitrous oxide and methane, with agriculture being far and away the largest emitter of nitrous oxide and a major emitter of methane, both of which are more intense greenhouse gases than carbon dioxide. So we got to look at those things, and also things like water use and nutrient use efficiency. How many of these nutrients are actually making it into the plant versus being lost via emissions or making it into a waterway? And I saw hypoxic zones mentioned there. I mean, that's a huge thing that we need to think about in agriculture. So that's really what we do at Habitare. We're not just looking at soil carbon. We're not just looking at productivity. We're looking at the full net system impact above ground and below ground. All sources of emissions from agriculture. We're able to monitor and verify practices. So if a farmer is looking to improve tillage, add a cover crop, potentially improve yield in the context of reduced fertilizer application, we can monitor and quantify all those things. And we do that at very large scale. So our founder, Dr. Kai Yuan at the University of Illinois, is really the key person behind this technology, with a lab of about 30 PhDs and postdocs that he's working with, and doing some really, really cool things with pulling all these systems together. So that's where I said I get excited about these other fine folks on the panel with us, is, we could be one of those tools on the Eiwa platform. And we could definitely use some of that hyperspectral drone data as an input to our model. So that's where we pull that data together. And we're not just using remote sensing. We're not doing anything, honestly, that crazy special. Like, we're using a lot of publicly available satellite data, but it's the way that you fuse that data together, combine that with process-based models that are replicating the whole plant growth process. And then one of the things that we do that I get really excited about is we are continuously reconstraining our model to actual field level observations on a daily time step. So we can estimate with accuracy how much photosynthesis happened in that particular cornfield on that particular day. So rather than just looking at vegetation indices, we can continuously reconstrain the model to what's actually happening in the real world, thereby making our yield forecast a lot more accurate, but also saying, okay, what happened with that carbon cycle of carbon dioxide coming in through photosynthesis, and then plant soil respiration, and ultimately what stayed in or left the soil. And as you can imagine, that's really computationally intensive, so AI and ML processes to speed up that computation. With that development, we've gone from field taking upwards of 3 days in a CPU to about 30 seconds in a GPU node. So it's incredible what you can do when you get those computational efficiencies. So we're working across millions and millions of acres today. So a little bit broader picture of the team. The best technology doesn't deploy itself. You need these wonderful, wonderful people that I get to work with. Decades of experience in agribusiness, ag policy, and all things around ecosystem modeling in agriculture. So just a brief mention on some of the things that we've done. So recently, I'm sure most people in here are familiar with USDA Climate Smart Commodities. So we're honored to be a partner on one of those grants. So we'll be quantifying outcomes on upwards of 3 million acres over the next 5 years, working with a number of different commercial customers. And we are really excited to be here in St. Louis. That's actually a major thing for us over the last year. What brought me here and ultimately Habitare here. I got to give a shout out to the wonderful people at Arch Grants. We were an Arch Grant recipient last year. And it's been just a great experience to be here in St. Louis. So I love pulling the different aspects of ag tech and geospatial together. So with that, I will wrap it up because I really look forward to hearing some questions from the group in here. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. All right, and last but certainly not least, we have George Worrall, Director of Deep Grain. Sorry.
Hello, everyone. So, I'll do things slightly differently today. What I want to go over with you is just kind of a story of how the premise behind Deep Grain came about. So, we're going to start off in rainy northwest England. Just laughing over there. Then we'll talk about big data in agriculture, or maybe something a little different take on that. And then a prophetic red line that in most years can do my job better than I can do it myself. So this is the Sackville Street building in Manchester. I walked in and out of this building many times during my graduate career, and they don't grow any corn in this building, but what they do is grow great physicists. Rutherford was based here. That's where he did his work for the Nobel Prize. And also, if you've ever had a CT scan, medical CT imaging was developed in this building. I went there for electrical engineering, and when I was there, I was exposed to a professor named Bruce Grieve, who had just come out of industry and agriculture. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do in terms of a career, but he's saying, look, there's a bunch of great sensors. We're working on them. Come along, and we'll talk about these kind of things. And so we started reading papers and talking about, okay, satellite remote sensing, this kind of stuff. What are the applications in agriculture? And I started to read more and more about your different kind of crop production forecasting systems. And they're published regularly in academia, and you'll read different papers on them. You can kind of group them into two different types. You've got your weather-based forecasting and your satellite-based forecasting. And as a young grad student in electrical engineering, I was thinking, great, we've got millions of samples, millions of data points. We can just plug this in, and we're done. What I didn't know at the time, and I would learn later, is there's a few assumptions we make in a lot of these crop production forecasting models that don't actually hold. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more a little later on. So this is what people are doing when they're building these systems. They're essentially trying to forecast one end-of-season number in terms of either national, regional production, or county-level yields. This is the 2021 yields for corn in the US. And if you want to be a corn county when you grow up, you want to be Delaware County, Iowa, which is the black square in the middle there. Those guys are the kings of growing corn. Last year they had 260-something bushels per acre in water-fed, rain-fed land. So what happened next is, okay, I'm reading about these models, I'm learning about these different systems, but I realized I actually know absolutely nothing about agricultural production systems. And I didn't make that realization myself. My professor told me it. And so he said, why don't you go do some more schooling at somewhere where they do a bit more agriculture? I thought, great. Luckily enough, Florida said, okay, would you like to come down? And the great thing about Florida and many institutions around the US is we have this land grant system in this country, which means we have extension agents working with professors, working with growers. And unlike in England, where there's not too much interaction between researchers and farmers, here, especially at institutions like Florida, you've got extension stations where you can drive out and you can see research being put into action in the field. And then you can see farmers coming along and inspecting and having conversations with extension agents about how it might impact them. So one day, it was 4th of July, 2021, I drove out to the Florida Panhandle to J Research Station. J Research Station is so remote, I wanted to put a picture of it up here. There are no pictures online of J Research Station. But they grow a bunch of different crops there, Panhandle, Florida, and a friend of mine was out there for 6 months doing some trials. He was doing industrial hemp trials. And it was his second year there, and I said, all right, what's going on? You got your field, you're growing a bunch of varieties. Why are you doing it 2 or 3 years in a row? Why can't you just take all these different fields, stick them into a model, and then we can just kind of model what's going to happen next year. You don't have to come back to Jay. And I remember a sunburned face, and in his German tongue accent, which is, again, a lot of us in agriculture coming over from Europe to learn here, he said, George, there's no such thing as big data in agronomy. He said, you think I'd be getting sunburned face in this station in the middle of nowhere in the Panhandle, Florida, if we could just build a model by growing a bunch of stuff, sticking it in, and see what's going to happen next year? I thought, interesting. So I went back and I started looking. I said, well, how does this apply to what I'm trying to do? So this is what people are trying to forecast, and in the middle we've got Delaware County. But this is the correlation in corn yield in counties across the country with Delaware. This is the correlation in any given year over the last 20 years. And I started to realize, hang on a second, if these are all correlated, and even the differential year to year is correlated, are we making assumptions by taking each of these counties, if we're doing regional and national production, and saying they're all samples and they're all independent samples, we can stick them in? So the premise of deep grain came about from this one conversation in Jay, which is that rather than having millions of labeled samples, especially when you're doing national production, you really only have about 40 growing seasons worth of data. And each one of those is one sample. And you might have millions of data points, but it's still one sample. So what we do at Deep Grain is we try and make smaller models. We start with crop physiology first. So we go right down to the plant science level, and we build up our models based on how the crop interacts with the environment. And there's a great history of research in agronomy and how this works, and many process-based models that have absolutely no machine learning and are just based on the physiology and genetics. And we work together to fuse those models, those physiology models, with existing machine learning techniques to try and make more robust forecasts. So that's simple, right? If I just go up to a customer and I say, hey, we do this crop physiology thing, we can do it better than the competitor you're paying for right now. Well, it's not that simple, because this big red line is the trend line in yield for corn over the US since 1970. And last year, this was less than 2% off what national corn yield was. So in an easy season, any model can pretty much get it right. You can get a ruler and a pen, and it's only in these abnormal seasons that we start to see differences in what forecasts are happening from different companies. And I would imagine, but I don't have the data, that subscriber counts for these forecasting companies probably look like this line as well, this black line. So I was speaking to a few of these clients, and they're saying, well, we've already got this corn and soybean solution. Can you do anything else? And I heard from several different clients, can you do cocoa? And I was thinking, well, why don't anyone else also offer cocoa right now? It's because there's almost no data on cocoa production around the world. So our main product right now that we focus on is a cocoa production forecasting product for West Africa. And because we go from a crop physiology first approach, we can start to provide slightly more information on the conditions on the ground during any given day. And that's useful because less than 40% of West African production has any origination information. And all we get is a number that arrives at San Pedro, Abidjan, and other ports in the region. But because we've started from this physiology-first approach, we're able to offer these kind of products that other people can't if they're relying on that millions of samples, millions of labels approach. So I'll leave you today with a question which I'd love you to answer for me if I see you around the floor later on. Is there a crop you wish were forecast but currently isn't possible? If so, I'd love to talk to you about it. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Thanks, George. So we just had 4 great presentations on 4 great companies that all have one amazing thing in common. They are located here in St. Louis. In the Heartland. So I want to start with a question around that. What, for those of you that started here, or for that sort of relocated or opened your kind of next office here in St. Louis, what was the tipping point? What was the deciding factor to be here in the Heartland? Let's start with you, Carlos.
Okay, thank you. For Eiwa specifically, it was about investment. One of our early investors, the Yield Lab, it's here in St. Louis. So this was a seed investor. So that's how we came in base here. I was already here. I'm a transplant from Brazil, former Monsanto employee. So I was already in town. But for the Eiwa, that was a decision.
Awesome.
Grew up here, been gone for a very long time, and came back for family reasons. And I'll never forget one day I was like, well, I can't run companies in Atlanta and come home and do this effectively. And I was walking up the steps while visiting my mother, and I heard something on the news about this geospatial thing. I was like, wait a minute. So I remember walking backwards down the steps to kind of catch the news. And I was just like, wow, I couldn't have planned that any better. And so then I was like, well, this is perfect. So I opened up an office, and we were one of the founding companies, founding startups at T-Rex, and they've been awesome. And we have offices in Atlanta, but you know, as a Midwest kid, University of Illinois, this was great. So, yeah.
Amazing. Nick?
Yeah, already mentioned Arch Grants, of course. But to be honest, you know, Arch Grants, it's really helpful, but it's not necessarily about the money. Depending on the stage of the company, it's not necessarily a transformative amount of money, but what really attracted us to St. Louis is we operate at that nexus of geospatial and ag tech. And I don't know that there's a better city in the entire country, borderline the world, for the convergence of those two things. Didn't hurt that our founder and a lot of our science team is about 2 hours away, right? So that's helpful at the UIUC. But yeah, it's really about the network and the connections here, and it's amazing. You just bump into so many people. I mean, this panel, I wasn't sure, you know, what the commonalities would be, and right there, you know. So it's been great for us so far.
I have to agree with Nick. I don't think there's a city in the world that does geospatial and agriculture combination better. Why I came to St. Louis was I was at a conference in Malaysia presenting some geospatial ag research, and I was telling someone about this idea for deep grain, and he just turned around and said, well, if you're going to do geospatial agriculture, you've got to move to St. Louis. And so, oh, interesting. And I'd heard of the town, didn't really know anything about it, and I looked it up, and then 6 months later, I got in my car, drove from Gainesville, Florida to St. Louis.
That was excuse me, that sounds like a pretty tough sell, George. That was awesome. So interesting, mostly for pretty unique answers, but each of you probably, there's probably some overlap with all of those factors and how they interact with each of you. Let's take a step deeper into what it's like operating your business here in the Heartland. Beyond what you just said, what are the advantages that you, as a business owner and operator, are able to capitalize on being here in the Heartland that you wouldn't be able to somewhere else? Any takers on who wants to go first? I won't put Carlos through it again.
I'll start again.
But he volunteers.
Well, I mean, my previous answer, obviously, that was the kick start to be in St. Louis, but obviously being able to stay in St. Louis, right? Sometimes you're invited to start in a specific geography, but it has to make sense economically and also based on your business outreach. So definitely being in the Midwest, most of our customers today I can reach basically on a car drive in about 6 hours from here, and I can reach probably 90% of my customers. So easy to get around the Midwest. The other thing is there are companies based here in St. Louis that are important for our business, but like was said before here, these connections with other entities in town and education institutions, technology institutions, that has been very key for us as well. Like I mentioned on my presentation, we're expanding our analytics library with partners. And one of those partners was a company that was here in St. Louis. I had no idea they existed. They were introduced to us about 2 months ago. And fantastic company, and we're in discussions now to have a partnership with them. So I think that combination is really what keeps us in St. Louis, and we'll definitely continue to grow here.
Yeah, I would say that people get it. There are only a few areas in the country where people really focus, for me, especially on the drone side of things. But on the geospatial piece, I don't have to explain that. And I go other places, they're like, what? And trying to help them understand the overlaps of photogrammetry and geospatial data use cases. And I think the second part is that people are hungry here and are interested in new tech. And I'm seeing this whole geospatial ecosystem really ramp up quickly, like extremely so. I think if it wasn't for COVID, we definitely would probably be where we are now, 2 years ago. But yeah, and I think the ease of meeting people, my relationships and partnerships are across all academic institutions, it seems here, and also growing in the private sector. So yeah, I think people here get it and they're hungry.
Yeah, I would definitely echo the hunger piece that you mentioned there. It's really great, if you're running a tech startup and you're in Silicon Valley, you are pounding on people's doors, asking for help. You are one of so many, and it's just, it's a different environment. And then there's an authenticity piece as well. That the farm boy in me has a really hard time with companies that are telling farmers how to farm that have never been out of California. So, being in a place where it's full of people that are authentically dedicated to the space, to seeing these companies succeed, and then just that passion of everybody that I talk to, it's, we're not beating down people's doors to help us. They're beating down our door to find out how they can help us and introduce us and guide us and provide resources and things like that. So I really love the passion that this community has for seeing companies succeed here and stay here, hopefully. So.
For me, it's proximity to places like the Danforth, UMSL, SLU. So the models we build, we really try to pull from the latest published literature, but that's great if you're just reading the PDF. But what we can do is walk down the road and have conversations with scientists who are working on plant science research that we will actively try and integrate into our models. And having particularly Danforth just down the road means that you can have conversations with people who are doing that day to day, which really makes a difference when it comes to integrating stuff faster, but also getting opinions. So I could read something and I could say, look, this looks interesting, and then I can phone up someone I know at Danforth and ask them, hey, what's your opinion on this area here? Do you think it's worth pursuing? And I get a really immediate feedback that is informal but also informative.
That's great. I think, so I heard two kind of buckets there. Proximity certainly still matters. I was thinking about this question beforehand and thinking in a post-COVID world where Zoom, everyone is very well trained on Zoom, although we can still not come off mute. We are used to it, right? But it still matters a lot. We still need to get in the room with people, whether it be researchers that are helping us further the product or clients. It still matters a lot, and maybe even more so here in this. And then everything that's happening with geospatial in St. Louis, the fact that people are hungry around it, I think is incredible. Big conference last week, and I've been hearing it probably for about a year, where people start to say, there's really something here, there's really something here. And then I heard it more than ever last week. People say, things are happening here. Like, it's actually happening, it's coming off the paper. It's so that's amazing to see, and even more amazing that it's impacting your businesses in a positive way. I think that's everyone's goal. So that's great. Next, let's think about how, so we have a room full of people, not all of them are from the Heartland. How can they get engaged with your companies, with the Heartland in a meaningful way, with Innovators here? How do you envision that partnership? Got it, Carlos?
I'll be last.
Okay. Any takers?
Sure, I'll take a shot. Yeah, so we're always looking to learn from people that are anywhere in the ag tech and geospatial space. But as I mentioned, for us at Habitare, we're really looking at climate impact and how that translates across the ag value chain. So I would say anybody and everybody that's in a place where they're thinking about that, which is going to be any food and agriculture company, absolutely should be thinking about that, and most of them are at this point. We want to learn, what is needed, what are the gaps, because these solutions are certainly a work in progress. So we're always looking for that kind of feedback, and of course potential partnerships. But more than anything, it's as we're scaling and trying to create an impactful solution, just the more feedback, the better. So I'd welcome anybody to reach out and come into great events like this. Like I feel like there's new events every week. George and I were just talking about, like, man, how do you prioritize actually getting your work done when there's all this stuff going on? But yeah, just show up at events, get curious. I think there's a lot we can do together.
I'll go next. For us, it's pretty clear. I'm looking to scale, so we're looking for customers, both on the government side as well as private sector, who are seeking drone services, and then also investment. If you got your checkbook in your bag, you can write it out to me. But so that we can actually go and deeper develop the autonomous systems that we're working on. We already have a lot of the partners on engineering capabilities. And then also this piece on deep data. We want to go a little deeper than any of our competitors are going, so that we can provide very rich data, but that's very quick. Like I said, processing data on the drone, right at the edge. And I sit on a couple of committees with many of the senior executives in telecom, and we're working on testing standards and capabilities around 5G for communications, real time, or as close to real time as possible. So, there's a lot of innovation going on in this space right now. So yeah, for us, it's ZeoAir.com. BMM at ZeoAir.com if you need me. But yeah, these are the projects that we're, missions that we're looking to fly, and the partners that we want to work with that'll help us scale and grow. Right now, we are, domestically based, since me and my team of pilots are all FAA, so we're, governed by the U.S. regulations. But I've been getting approached by some folks outside the U.S. where we will probably sell product or equipment, but from a service perspective, I'm like, let me kind of get the U.S. figured out. And then we had a conversation with an agency that works out of space, and I think you might know who that is. And they're like, can you do this on the moon and Mars? I was like, I just want to get the Earth right first. But yeah, so we're open. Thank you.
I would say, really that question I had on my last slide. So I love talking about different crop production systems, and specifically in regions that right now don't have ground survey infrastructure. One project we're working on right now is mapping cocoa production in South America, because there's not really that much information in where exactly it's grown to the plantation location. So if you have like a specific crop or something that you're even just interested in, not commercially, but you're looking at a research project or an area that you care about in terms of food security, just come up to me and have a chat afterwards. And if you don't reach me today, deepgrain.com is where you can find the contact information.
Similar to everybody else here, but I'm going to use our hashtag. We want to Eiwa your data. So don't be shy. You'll be amazed at companies that I get to talk to. They're sometimes multi-million, sometimes multi-billion companies that still within their R&D departments and other groups are still depending heavily in Excel, pivot tables, and PowerPoints. So don't be shy. Reach us at the eiwa.ag website, and I'm looking forward to working with you. We're also looking for investment. So as any other startup, we're growing. Like I said, our teams here in the U.S., in Brazil, in Argentina, and looking into going to Europe and Asia after next year. So we're here. Thank you.
I have one more question, and then we have about 8 minutes left, so we might have time for one from the audience, but if not, please hunt these guys down and ask them. So our last question, we were kind of speaking to the folks that are visiting from out of town. I want this question, I want to talk to folks that are in St. Louis that are building this ecosystem. As we're doing that, as we're building this ecosystem, what do you need next? How can the ecosystem better support you and your business as we continue to grow?
I mean, it's pretty much what I was sharing. Yes, pretty much the same. We love our academic partnerships, looking for, going a little bit deeper in that space. But, it always, for startups, it always just comes down to opportunity and being able to then partner. I think, having worked in startup ecosystems, in Georgia, worked out of Silicon Valley for a while in different capacities, it's so important for startups to be able to be a part of the community where private sector or other entities that startup is targeting gives them an opportunity for proof of concept, investment, because that's how startups grow. And so those opportunities are so valuable, even if they're small, to large, but also then resource sharing at times where it could be a skilled individual that has a certain skill set that the startup doesn't have from a mentoring perspective or some kind of advisory perspective is also critical and important.
I just got the signal from Nicole in about 2 minutes.
Oh.
2 minutes?
Nicole is the boss. So.
All right, well, I can't help but jump in on this one, so I'll make it quick. Yeah, I completely agree with kind of the opportunity to pilot, and one interesting thing that can happen there is entities can help large companies basically de-risk piloting something with a small technology. It gets to be really resource intensive for us as a small startup, as well as for the company, to kind of negotiate this kind of squishy, what are we actually going to do together here? How do we scope a pilot? That kind of thing. You end up spending a lot of time just scoping and trying to get it off the ground where both entities can easily benefit from it. So some form of matchmaking, I think, can be really valuable. And then the other thing I'll say is a challenge is we raised seed funding last year. We're looking to probably move to a Series A later on this year. But as I'm looking at strategy around that, there's some great investors around here, but we don't expect to stop at Series A. We expect to be Series A, B, C potentially, and see how that goes. But when we look at having investors throughout the journey, it's really important, I think, to have a great relationship with an investor that can kind of come along with you in that journey. And that's one of the challenges that we have in this ecosystem is just kind of that full spectrum of investment. A few areas are pretty well covered and a few areas have gaps. So that's a challenge that I throw to the community. We might not have those investors primarily located here, but just to create St. Louis as a true hub for that and think about that full funding journey for companies that are going to scale aggressively, I think would bring a lot of value to keeping startups here as they grow so they don't outgrow the community.
I would say, just as one final note, if you know any companies that are involved in ag and geospatial, send them to St. Louis, because the big thing that I've found is beneficial in this ecosystem is just the chance encounters at different places. I'm based at T-Rex, and some of the best conversations I've had in St. Louis have just been at the T-Rex bar at 5 p.m. on a Friday, where someone else comes down and say, "Oh, how you doing? Yeah, good. What are you working on?" And then we end up being there for 2 hours talking about different things, all geospatial. So I think, it's just what would improve is just getting more companies in and keeping those conversations going and growing.
I'll wrap it up real quick. I just want to actually thank the St. Louis community, investors, the ecosystems, 39 North, and all the other groups that I've been involved with in the last several years. Because since I left Monsanto, I've been kind of a beneficiary of that, me and my family, obviously. So I've been in this startup community for years. This is the third startup I worked in St. Louis. And my wife also works for Benson Hill for the last 6 years. So both are totally, a fruit of this and being able to stay in town, not having to go out and move around the country or outside the country to find, something that really helped us grow and grow our family. So I really want to thank the entire community here. Thank you.
All right. They're going to kick us off the stage, so we got to get out of here. Thank you.